Good afternoon, Minister for Trade and Industry, Chan Chun Sing, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. A warm welcome to this afternoon's launch of the book, Government in Business, Leading or Lagging, by former Singapore Minister Lim Hwee Hua. Today, we are honored to have Minister Chan gracing this special occasion. Thank you all for making your way down to this location at this lovely SIM site with safe distancing measures in place. And we also welcome our guests, over 170 of them from over 20 countries, joining virtually via Zoom this morning or afternoon, wherever you are. My name is Theodora from Tembusu Partners, and I'll be your MC today. This event is co-organized by World Scientific Publishing, Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy of NUS, and the Singapore Institute of Management. Ladies and gentlemen, it gives me great pleasure now to invite the author, Mrs. Lim Hwee Hua, to deliver the introduction. Mrs. Lim, please.
Very good afternoon to all of you, and good morning to those who are joining us virtually. First of all, let me thank Minister Chan Chun Sing for so kindly agreeing to be present today to address us and to share his thoughts. I also want to express my deepest appreciation to all you friends who are here today, as well as to welcome those who are joining us virtually. Allow me now to share with you some of my perspectives of the evergreen debate over the role or roles of government in business, so often referred to as the public-private divide. Now, this is perhaps a realistic depiction of how the government of many countries is currently being pulled in many directions. Whilst business as usual would still require the pursuit of plans that preserve security and the protection of national interests, the COVID pandemic has aggravated the fiscal burden of bailouts and stimulus packages, especially to counter unemployment. Meanwhile, the public is looking to clear leadership in not just tackling the health crisis, but also supporting the collapsing economy. When I first explored the various themes around the role of government in business, never have I thought that I would witness the about turn of long-held assertions all in the space of less than 1 year. Where it was fashionable not so long ago to incline towards a less government, more market economy, the COVID pandemic has turned everything on its head. All at once, the government had to take control of everything, from the regulation of the procurement of surgical masks to personal protective equipment, to oversight of both the public and private healthcare facilities, and now obviously to the availability of vaccines, as well as the execution of the vaccination program. On the economic front, some of the harshest but deemed absolutely necessary steps taken, like lockdowns, pertained to grinding all activity to a halt. This wide-scale economic activity curb, unfortunately, has meant that unemployment would spike to unprecedented levels. Add to that, there's the burden of ballooning bailouts of a wide range of businesses beyond the usual state-owned enterprises. Let me now just return to the pre-COVID days. Pre-COVID, we often hear the rumbling of how the state is always playing catch-up, and this is particularly noticeable in innovation-centric businesses where domains or even markets overlap, for example, in fintech and the sharing economy like ride-sharing or even accommodation sharing. Dissatisfaction with the government has often been expressed over a few fronts. Firstly, over the apparent inability to regulate new services properly, to a lack of innovation bent, and to an overreaction tendency, essentially locking the stable doors after the horses have bolted. So in short, the government is often depicted as a lagging regulator, inept and incompetent, if not a little breathless. I would argue that this criticism may not be justified. It is in the nature of entrepreneurship and capitalism to constantly exploit new opportunities, looking for lacuna in regulatory frameworks. The quest to beat the system and the returns achieved by successful ventures would be attractive enough to enable the private sector to continually attract and reward the necessary talent. There is therefore an unlevel playing field. It may be challenging for any government to be able to attract and retain its fair share of talent ordinarily in order to preempt trends and to prescribe the necessary rules, be it for regulation of a strategic sector or for competition reasons. Letting innovation blossom has proven to be a good thing, especially for consumers. Think about how gloriously easy it is to make payments without having to write a check or to pay, in cash in person. Fintech will therefore continue to delight customers and consumers while posing some real challenges to regulators. Where innovation encroaches into a regulated domain and poses real or potential systemic risks, the state has no choice but is forced to respond. Social ills can also result from excessive or the wrong use of fintech innovations, real or anticipated. For example, the unbridled extension of personal credit bypassing the prudential standards of the banking system has to be reined in at some point. Technology generally has been a plus, but left on its own and in the wrong hands, it can pose a threat. So take, for example, drones. Great for hobbies like photography, but a real menace to planes at the airport. Hence, are there occasions when intervention may be justified? Of course, some may argue, but timing, as we all know, is everything. Unfortunately, it's not a luxury that the government has, as everyone with a 2020 hindsight wants the government to have acted yesterday. Conversely, would proactive regulation stifle innovation? I believe so. But it really doesn't have to be a zero-sum game. Striking the right balance between the amount of public and private participation is often a work in progress. There are many national aspirations that would require the government to partner the private sector so as to realize national growth ambitions. This is all the more so post the current pandemic, given the now empty public coffers and the burgeoning debt levels in many countries. Yet, we know that many public-private partnerships or PPPs have come to grief. What steps can governments take to minimize such risks? What are the lessons that the state should take note of, especially in terms of project conceptualization and increasingly keeping politics out of the way? Notwithstanding the possibility of collaboration, there exist many instances of market failure that only the government is in a position to address. The more obvious undertakings belong in infrastructural development, especially of capital-intensive transportation projects like airports and seaports, and city planning. The easier tasks may be found in seeding innovation or new growth sectors. The longer-term and often ignored priorities revolve around the unpopular economic restructuring or climate change responsibilities. There's a fine line between the government being the driver owing to market failure and ending up as the bailer of last resort. There are many examples of bloated state enterprises all over the world. No thanks to COVID, government bailouts have taken on greater prominence and proportions. There is no shortage of examples where a state bailout is the only way out. The airlines are the largest casualty of the travel restrictions brought about by the pandemic. Yet we all know there are airlines and there are airlines. There are airlines that the public has long urged the governments not to support, even pre-COVID. The bailer of last resort role, unfortunately, will survive the pandemic. For as long as a country has too big to fail national icons, especially banks and bloated state enterprises, there would always be the social or political pressure to mount a rescue for the economy's sake. Let me now turn to and comment on an emerging widespread political reality all around us, that of populism. These days, unfortunately, politicians appear to live and die by the ballot box. It's common for parties in many countries to be voted out after just one term of 3 to 5 years. Populism and the resulting short-termism would continue to pose the greatest challenge to any planning for the long term, especially that of building sustainable growth. Some governments willfully conflate their roles as regulators and capital providers towards political ends and essentially go for quick wins, the low-hanging fruits. Unfortunately, it becomes a vicious cycle. Aggravating this trend are the rapid shifts in expectations of the people, especially of the type of public goods and services. This runs the gamut of price regulation of transport services to the quality of public housing, to the degree of divestment of state enterprises. Let me now move on to the role that only the government can undertake, and that is of strategic and security considerations. Many global investors note with increasing concern the rising incidence of the use of the national security or strategic argument by many governments to reject a foreign investment. And this undeniably smacks of xenophobia. But nationalistic instincts are at the highest in many large economies, and geopolitical considerations are actively in play. These tend to dominate conversations rather than whether there are truly risks to opening up certain key or sensitive sectors. Conversely, social services such as health, education, and housing tend to be an area where many governments remain coy about active participation. The business of the government is never done. The spotlight will continue to be shone on whether it's leading or lagging. I apologize for raising more questions than providing answers. Allow me to end with a little confession. Over the years, I've gone from being an avid reader to a poor reader to a non-book reader. But I continue to buy books that I intend to read. Meanwhile, I consume plenty of news pushed to me on a daily bite-sized basis. Hence, I've written this book for the non-book reader like me. The chapters and the cases are all or can all be read piecemeal. I hope you will enjoy reading the book as much as I have had fun putting it together. So once again, let me thank Minister and all of you for your presence here today.
Thank you, Mrs. Lim. Ladies and gentlemen, it is my pleasure to invite Guest of Honor, Minister for Trade and Industry, Chan Chun Sing, to deliver the keynote address. Minister Chan, please.
Mr. Wong, Mr. George Shou, ladies and gentlemen, very good afternoon to all of you. Thank you to Hwee Hua. Thank you to Hwee Hua for inviting me for the launch of your book, which I have the privilege to read last month when you gave it to me. You gave it an advance copy to me. This book is a timely reminder of the extraordinary times that we live in. As Hwee Hua pointed out, the pandemic has brought to the fore the role of governments around the world, from ensuring the health and safety of our people, to securing vaccines and essential supplies, to supporting businesses and workers to tide over the crisis. Each of these decisions directly impact millions of lives and livelihoods. Globally, we have witnessed how they have sparked off collective reflection over the duty and remit of government. However, the heart of this debate is not new. Throughout history, we have seen a plethora of theories over the role of government. Some examples. The Qing dynasty, China's first imperial dynasty, was anchored by legalism, an ideology that prized social order, strict adherence to rules, and strong state control. In the West, the Keynesian school gained prominence during the Great Depression and the post-war years, when government spending and regulation expanded significantly. This was followed by a return to a more limited government and laissez-faire market policies from the 1980s. The question of big or small, active or passive government might be the subject of vigorous debates in many countries. But here in Singapore, we have never been beholden to ideological or philosophical preconceptions. Singapore's unique circumstances demanded the ingenuity of our people, public and private sectors. When the British withdrew their bases east of Suez, they accounted for about 20% of our GNP. Faced with a lack of natural resources, models could not be simply adopted. They had to be adapted for our own unique circumstances. Then Finance Minister Dr. Goh Keng Swee was one of our chief architects of our early economic and national development. When asked later about his visionary role, Dr. Goh said, "I had no initial vision. You just started and hoped for the best." Now, it's not that Dr. Goh set out with no aim or direction in mind, but it is about agility, humility, and learning by doing. We don't fall prey to our plans, and we don't let that bind us from challenging our own assumptions. Or as they say, we don't fall in love with our plans. We have to constantly challenge our own assumptions and make adjustments as necessary. The 64 case studies featured in this book show that theory often sees unexpected deviations when put into practice, even with the best of intention. For Singapore, we distill the essence from different countries, different models, and tailor them to our own unique context. Just like how we have done so for a multiracial, multicultural, multilingual society. And I would think that our model of governance as one that evolves with time and in context. And that's important. One that evolves with time and in context. This is something that we have never taken for granted and is always a work in progress. So instead of being caught up in theoretical debates, we need to understand what works best for us, apply it boldly, creatively, and judiciously. As a nation, we have weathered numerous crises precisely because we have never been dogmatic about our approach. Some of us might be tempted to see COVID-19 as a temporary disruption. But the truth is that profound global shifts were already underway prior to COVID. And if anything, COVID has accelerated many of these trends. I'd like to highlight 3 key trends to get us thinking about the role of governments in business. First, growing geopolitical uncertainty is reshaping the global trade and production patterns. Major powers are facing increasing domestic pressures, and it is unsurprising that many of them have become more circumspect about exercising global leadership. And that is one of the contributing factors to the malaise in various international organizations. Even before COVID-19, we were witnessing a shift in many supply chains from just-in-time to just-in-case in response to the growing fragmentation of the global system. Now, with COVID, we can expect further reorganization through reshoring, onshoring, and diversification to hedge against the vagaries of geopolitics. In fact, COVID has made people much more conscious on the need for resilient and trusted supply chains. And many corporations around the world are re-examining the layout of their global production patterns and global supply chains. Likewise, many governments around the world are re-examining their partnerships, their supply chains with their partners around the world. Faced with a more unpredictable global order, the question is, how can the governments step up to be an active, integrative force on the global stage and to preserve a rule-based system, to uphold and to update a rules-based system, while at the same time building a competitive and resilient economy at home to mitigate against the populist pressures that might distract and not allow governments to take on their international leadership responsibilities. And we all know that politics start at home. A weak and divided domestic populace will never allow a country to exercise its responsibility in the regional or global circuits. Second, rapid advancements in technology and digitalization is changing and will continue to change the way we live and work. During the pandemic, we saw the deployment of digital technologies such as teleconferencing, payment systems, delivery platforms, and e-commerce on an unprecedented scale at unprecedented speed. Many of the digital giants told us they achieved in 3 months what it would have taken them 3 years previously. Many of our own enterprises share with us that the crisis has necessitated them to accelerate the pace of change, again, achieving what they need to do in years in just a couple of months. We, too, had to adapt quickly. Hwee Hua mentioned the example of taxi and private hire drivers who were allowed to deliver food and groceries to supplement their income while meeting the surging demand on delivery platforms. This is but one example. Both in peacetime and especially in times of crisis, the challenge is how do we enable businesses to transcend local markets to create new products and services to not just serve the local market, but to serve the global market, especially so for Singapore. How do we equip our workers with the skills to capture these new opportunities? I've always encouraged our businesses to strengthen their capabilities to compete on the basis of quality and standards rather than on quantity or cost, to improve our speed to market and also our speed to evolve. So in today's world, competition is not just about being able to produce a better quality product cheaper and of a certain standard. Competition is increasingly about our ability to evolve products, services, and production systems at speed in response to the changes in the market demand, which is accelerating. So this applies to government as well, for government to keep pace with the demands of the market and businesses. If we do not move fast enough to foster the right environment to allow businesses to mobilize capital, aggregate talent, and protect intellectual property, we will be bypassed. Whichever government, whoever can do this better, meaning able to aggregate talent, mobilize capital, and protect intellectual property better, will be able to attract a new generation of businesses that are less dependent on the previous factors of production like cost of labor, cost of land. And I think that is where our competitive advantage will be going forward. And this ability to evolve at speed will also make us much more difficult to displace in the global value chain. So we are not competing on the basis of price or cost. We are competing on the basis of our ability to evolve at speed to provide the right conditions to enable businesses to thrive. Now, the third set of forces that we have to contend with is the widening disparity in incomes, both across and within economies. The gains of globalization have not been equitably distributed to all. In fact, a recent UN report showed that more than 2/3 of the world's population live in countries with a growing wealth gap. If left unchecked, this will increase the resistance to globalization, trade openness, trade connectivity, and regional integration. All of these, which are critical factors to our success in the past decades. There are no silver bullets, and we are always having to deal with trade-offs in public policy. In the face of this delicate balance, governments must strive for the courage to press on with sound, long-term policies. Sound, coherent, consistent long-term policies. Help our businesses and workers embrace the new realities and ensure that the fruits of growth is enjoyed by all. So how do we continue to succeed with our own unique set of governance principles? I'll just offer 3 hypotheses today. First, the government's role as a regulator should not and cannot be seen as purely defensive play, meaning rules cannot be just about preventing bad things from happening. Rules have to be also, more importantly, about enabling good things to happen. As Hwee Hua mentioned, regulation often lags behind innovation, especially when it straddles multiple domains or when traditionally distinct sectors merge. Our goal is not to play catch-up reactively. We want to be a proactive enabler of innovation, opportunity, and growth. Our Pro-Enterprise Panel, or PEP, plays a vital role in ensuring that we keep abreast of the concerns of our business leaders, entrepreneurs, and innovators. Since its founding in 2000, the PEP has taken in over 2,000 suggestions. More than half of these have contributed to concrete regulatory changes. I've spoken about our transition to PEP 2.0, which is about being progressive, enabling, and pioneering. Through PEP 2.0, we want to optimize regulations at the system level to give businesses the bandwidth to experiment and scale up. Let me share one example from the Singapore Civil Defence Force, or SCDF. Recently, SCDF noticed that it was receiving about 6,000 applications a year for temporary change of use licenses. These were usually from businesses who wish to use a particular venue for events. SCDF decided to automatically approve such applications with the appropriate safeguards. Once implemented, this will reduce both the waiting time for businesses and the man hours we take to process such applications. Together with the PEP, the SCDF has taken a bold and risk-calibrated approach to reduce costs for both itself and businesses. Now, this might not seem like a major move, but it is precisely incremental improvements like this that cumulatively allow our industries and to continue to grow their operations and continually allow us to refresh our regulations. Regulatory agility is therefore key. In Singapore, regulatory agility is not an oxymoron. In many countries, it may be seen as such. The question is, how can we ensure that our regulations are consistent, predictable, and serve the public interest while allowing business ideas to germinate? Our regulatory sandboxes in fintech, healthcare, energy, and more all play critical roles. The PEP's New Idea Scheme also enables businesses and agencies to accelerate and standardize the facilitation of new ideas, especially for those which might not fall neatly under the current regulatory frameworks. Through levers such as regulations, we will continue to ensure that our businesses stand ready to capture emerging opportunities in new sectors so as to entrench ourselves in the critical parts of the global value chain. However, I must emphasize, this is never a job done. It is always a work in progress because as technology continues to emerge and evolve, traditional sectors will continue to shift, collide, and even merge. Take, for example, the financial industry. Many years ago, I remember jokingly asking DBS and Singtel if they will ever merge. But perhaps at that point in time, it was an idea too far ahead of its time. But today, when we look back at the fintech sector, many of the opportunities are indeed created by the intersection of previous classification of sectors. And that will require regulators to broaden their perspective to beyond regulating their sector, to ask ourselves, how can we enable businesses to seize opportunities at the intersection of previous sectors or previous technologies? Now, that is an ongoing challenge. Now, the second hypothesis that I'll share today is this. If the market is unable to deliver a fair and just outcome to allow our businesses and people to fulfill their potential, then a responsible government must step in to balance the social and economic objectives. As a small and open economy, issues of resource allocations relate directly to our survival. From our public housing program to the implementation of the ethnic integration program or policy or EIP, which Hwee Hua mentioned, to mandating national service soon after independence. None of this would have happened if left to the market alone. These may also not always be popular decisions, but with the faith and industry of our people, they were given a chance to succeed. And more importantly, we apply models in context for our own circumstances and needs. More recently, our efforts in securing our trade security and supply chain resilience show the vital role of the government, especially in domains which businesses cannot navigate on its own, particularly in a crisis. At the height of the crisis, we sprang into action to keep our supply chains open and our trade flows moving. We also work with our businesses and partners across all sectors, mobilizing the entire nation's efforts in order to keep our supply chains going and robust. We work with our businesses, guiding them in implementing their business continuity plans, from manpower to logistics to supply chains, going into the circuit breaker period and coming out from the circuit breaker period. It was a whole of nation efforts. While border closures and trade restrictions created uncertainty around the world, we resisted the temptation to nationalize any essential goods and sought instead to diversify our sources of supply. We kept our promise to the world to keep the supply chains going and to never impose export restrictions for our own benefits, but to the detriment of the global supply chains. That earned us and reinforced our reputation as a trusted partner for people to put their investment in Singapore as part of their global diversification process. So in a world where populist voices often speak louder than sound policy, it is even more crucial that we build a foundation of trust and remain committed to the well-being of our people and businesses. Now, finally, to achieve all this, we'll continue to strengthen the public, private, and people collaboration. Our strong culture of tripartism between workers, businesses, and government have been a defining contributor to our success. To solve the increasing number of wicked problems that we face today, we need to bring together diverse groups of people with diverse aspirations from diverse backgrounds to find common ground. So today's world is not just about the issues or the outcomes that matter, but also about the solutioning process. How do we get diverse groups with diverse interests and aspirations to unite for the greater common good? To appreciate the multitude of aspirations that society wants to achieve and to bring out the best ideas and execute them together. And also to find solutions that can encompass and embrace the diversity of our society. Our efforts in open innovation challenges with government agencies and corporates through the Open Innovation Network and National Innovation Challenges embodies this spirit of collective problem solving. To give an example, older high-rise buildings in Singapore are required to undergo facade inspections. Several agencies co-launch an innovation call for solutions in drone inspection technology so that such inspections can be made safer and more efficiently. 5 consortiums were selected, one of which was a team comprising Singapore startup Claritas Technology, its partner Third Element Aviation, a German drone startup, and the Nanyang Technological University. As the project required broad use of technologies across different domains, the teams had to forge collaborative partnerships to bring their different expertise and capabilities together in co-developing a solution. We will also continue to experiment with new modes of public-private collaboration. The Alliances for Actions are one such example where we adopt an agile startup approach to get the public and private sectors to come together, mobilize their respective sectors to deliver quick pilots and prototypes. And finally, we will look to sending more public service officers on external attachments and learn and attract more talent from the private sector to increase the porosity between the private and public sectors. Only when we facilitate more porous exchange of talent across different domains can we seed more diverse ideas and perspectives and build more robust policies and implementation. So going forward, it's crucial that we continue to strengthen our engagement with our workers and businesses to ensure that our policies continue to serve the needs of the diverse groups amongst us, and that we can progress together as a nation to build a society where there are opportunities for all. Ultimately, in governance, there is no secret formula. Governance is about applying what is most appropriate in context. Our role is often fluid and multifaceted. We are never trying just to optimize a solution set for one particular objective. In fact, I always say, in economics, we were taught to achieve your objectives, it's always good to have more instruments than objectives. In government, this is not always the case. Sometimes you will have more objectives than policy instruments. And for the mathematical geeks amongst us, you will know that if you have more objectives than policy instruments, then gliding to a particular solution set is not often easy or possible. And that is where leadership comes in. Leadership to explain to our people where those trade-offs might be and how we can carry the ground and move forward together as a nation. So, governance is never philosophical, but always practical. And we are always undergirded by immutable principle, which is our commitment to transparency, consistency, and accountability. So the solutions are not fixed. The principles under which we derive the solutions are more permanent, and those have to do with transparency, consistency, and accountability. Our success thus far could not have been possible without the cohesion and understanding achieved through a high level of trust between government and people. And that is perhaps the secret sauce of our success. Because in every country, developing a solution set in the face of wicked problems is one order of magnitude of difficulty. Having developed that solution set, optimizing against the constraints that we have, the more difficult challenge in many countries have to do with convincing people and businesses that this is for the greater good of us. And without the deep trust between government and people, people and people, people and businesses, and so forth, it would not be possible for us to move together as one. And this COVID crisis is an example of how we have gone through and done what we have done. In a recent interview with a foreign media friend, when he asked me to share with him how we have been able to achieve what we have done for COVID, I explained to him what we have to do at the personal level, at the social level, at the community level, how we do our trace together, how we do our contact tracing, how we do our testing and our vaccination programs and so forth. And ultimately, he concluded, perhaps suspiciously, that I did not reveal anything to him that was new. All that we have done are things that are open and public knowledge. But he acknowledged, perhaps the success for Singapore was that we were able to do the simple things consistently, cohesively, and with discipline. So the secret wasn't in what we do. The secret was how we have done so. And this is where Hwee Hua's book come in such a apt time. Going forward, there will still be many more difficult problems for us to solve. We can debate on what is the most appropriate way for us to go forward as a country. We can look at other people's models, try to adapt them, adjust them for our own circumstances, and apply them in context. But ultimately, the ability to get things done will rest not just on who have the superior solutions, but who is able to execute that solution well as a people. And this is where, if we continue to maintain our cohesion, have the intellectual rigor to keep challenging ourselves, then I'm confident that we will continue to do well. And as Hwee Hua pointed out, there will not be a divide between people, private sector, or the public sector. We are all in this together to define a future uniquely for ourselves, in context, for our own circumstances. And this is what makes Singapore special, and this is what makes us different from many others, because we compete as a whole of nation, people, public sector, and private together, never seeing each other as competitors, but always seeing each other as partners in the global competition. Thank you very much. And thank you, Hwee Hua.
Thank you, Minister, for sharing your insights. Minister, may I invite you to remain on stage, please? At this moment, I would like to invite the author, Mrs. Lim Hwee Hua, Dr. Hwee Hua, Chairman and Editor-in-Chief, World Scientific, Ms. Yulin Goh, Chair of the SIM Governing Council, and unfortunately, Professor Danny Kwa, Dean of Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy, cannot make it today to join Minister on stage for the book launch, please. The lifting of the cloth and the unveiling of the cover will signify the official launch of the book, Government in Business, Leading or Lagging. At the count of 3, may I invite Minister Chan and Mrs. Lim to unveil the cover. 3, 2, 1. Round of applause. The next segment promises to be a topical and interesting discussion around the role of government in business Is it and should it be leading or lagging? May I now invite our distinguished panelists to join Mrs. Lim on stage. They are Professor Kishore Mahbubani, Distinguished Fellow, Asia Research Institute, Mr. Lien Chong Luen, General Manager, Gojek Singapore, and Mr. Viswa Sadasivan, Founder CEO, Strategic Moves, who will be the moderator. Over to you, Viswa.
The microphone on? Can you hear us? Okay. How long do we have? An hour? 45 minutes? About 45 minutes? Yeah, because we're running a bit behind time. Okay. Minister, thank you for the speech. Very thoughtful and thought-provoking. One of the things I picked up, was the differentiator, our new differentiator is evolve at speed to create opportunities. And perhaps we can talk a little bit about that, we can touch on that. But I'd like to start by quoting Hwee Hua, Chef Hwee Hua, right? One of the chairman of the U.S. Board of Trustees, and Hwee Hua, you in your review, you said this: 40 years ago, Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher rolled back the role of government in the economy and led a new era globally, this liberalization and a return to free enterprise and freer markets, right? Now, following the global financial crisis and now the COVID pandemic, the policy direction for many, if not most governments, has been reversing at this time. Governments are being called upon to deal with income inequality, climate change, the power of big tech, and the disruptions from digital revolution and de-globalisation. So it's something you touched on, Hwee Hua, that seems to be a reversal of a trend that took place several decades, probably starting with Milton Friedman in his famous article in 1970 in the New Yorker. But it's clearly a delicate dance, right, between government and the private sector. So I was thinking we could start with this question, a quick comment on, a very quick, short comment from each one of the panelists on what do you see as the role of government in business?
I will begin by saying that there's great asymmetry between what the public wants and what the government can actually execute properly. So there's always a tendency to overshoot because public policies, when they change or when changes are planned, you need time to work it in and to make sure that they're holistically applied and so on. But the public changes its mind quite quickly, a lot faster than the change can be accommodated through public policy changes. So that's something, so you tend to see this overshoot and misalignment. And that's, to me, the reality of what it is. And it's something that both on the part of government, the need to be more dynamic, to be more sure-footed is always there. The pressure is always there. But likewise, the public also needs to know that you don't just change policies overnight. It takes a lot to get things effective.
I remember I was at the St. Gallen Symposium 2 years ago, and there was this talk about how the policy clock always lags behind the technology clock. And it stands to reason, right? Because technology clock is driven very much by private sector initiative. And there's an incentive for them to move at great speed. But is it really wrong for the policy clock to go slower than the technology or innovation clock? Is it necessarily wrong? Because it gives you a chance to step back and observe before actually evolving your policy.
I would say perhaps there's no right or wrong, but every good government aspires to be completely holistic in the way it reviews its policy, that the implications are all, well studied into, and the changes are actually well formulated and executed. And this takes time.
Yeah.
Whereas the public will just say, I think it's nicer to have, flats that don't have common corridors. That changes overnight.
Right.
Whereas this requires a whole slate of changes which the the government would then have to look at. So, or in the case of technology and innovation, for them, if the business case doesn't work, they just pack up and go look for another business idea.
Right.
The government can't just pack up and say this idea doesn't work and move on. So government has a lot more and has wider responsibilities to respond to.
Okay. Lian?
Maybe I think there are two things I'd like to talk about. First is originally governments were the players. If you look back in history, and companies were actually by charter. So if you look at what people traditionally thought of as industries that the government must do, infrastructure, healthcare, education, that was always the government's role.
Yeah.
But now obviously that it's not that the government's space has decreased, it is that the nature of overlap has increased. We have a lot more health tech players, ed tech, and obviously a lot more private sector people moving into infrastructure development. So the government's role as a player, I think, is really a backstop. I think that's a point that has been made by Min Chan. And people expect that, but the rest of the space is a lot more taken up by the private sector. So maybe that's on the point of being a player. In terms of being a regulator, if any new industry first is trying to determine which is the technology that will win, right? Is it going to be Blu-ray DVD? Is it going to be carbon sequestration, or is it going to be carbon trading for clean cities? If that's not decided, it's very hard to regulate. Then once you know what is the winning technology, then you need to figure out a business model. Around this space, I think, is where governments really need to have a sense of the regulation. Then after that is which companies will win. So what's the winning technology? What's the winning business model? And what is the winning company?
Do you think governments should pick champions? Kishore?
Well, first, let me begin by congratulating Hwee Hua on this very, very timely book.
Now that's a consummate diplomat. Yeah.
No, watch my follow-up sentence.
Okay.
Because as Hwee Hua said, that's the issue of our time. And I think if you look at our world today, you can see very, very starkly that there are two different models emerging on what should be in a sense, the power relationship between government and business. So at what extreme you have the United States model, and there's no question whatsoever that in the United States, the private sector is far more powerful than the public sector.
Yeah.
There has even been regulatory capture, and some of the big corporations can do what they want to do, and it's very hard to stop them. And that's a result of what, as Hwee Hua said, Reagan and Thatcher said, government is not the solution, government is a problem, push government aside, everything will move.
Yeah.
And so far, the American model's been working, but now you have another model in China where clearly the government is in charge and the private sector is not. And yet the private sector in China is still very dynamic. But at the same time, the only country in the world that can regulate a company as big as Ant Financial is the Chinese government, because the Chinese government is much more powerful.
Right.
But I suspect that all governments in the world are going to have this tremendous challenge, finding the right balance about how much space you give to the private sector so they can succeed and they can run and blossom. And that's the American genius. They can produce Googles and Facebooks and you name it, Amazons, and very few countries can do that. Europeans can't do it, for example, right? So clearly, that's the situation we have in the world. How do you find the right balance between the role of government and the role of business? And that's why this book is timely.
Yeah. And it sort of, in that dance we're talking about, it lays down some rules and conventions, I guess.
Maybe if I can just jump in here. I think it's very tempting for one government to prescribe what works in his or her country to another economy that has completely different attributes. And I would just add that temptation should be resisted, because there are some economies where the state-owned enterprises dominate.
Yeah.
And you can't prescribe the same kind of free market enterprise to the workings of the economy as, say, you would the US, because the considerations are completely different. And it may well be very ill suited, or fitted to the other economy itself. Yeah.
Right. Now, a few days ago, DPM and Finance Minister Heng Swee Keat delivered the budget speech, and he announced an $870 million assistance package for the aviation sector. Right. Now, some people are asking why, and they are saying SIA, why should we bail them out? And these questions are coming up. But I note an interesting quote in your book, Hwee Hua. You said, the idea that governments should protect large icons from failure should be relied on as a last resort. Rescues must be limited to only players who are otherwise performing creditably. In other words, if you're not performing well, you should not bail them out. Now, I'll put this question to Mr. Gojek, as GM of Gojek. What's your sense? Okay, maybe you can.
No, go ahead.
Yeah. One of you.
No, but anyway, I would say it's an absolute mistake to think that you can rely completely on the private sector to decide whether companies should die or survive. And in the case of Singapore Airlines, to put it very bluntly, Singapore is the most open, globalized economy in the world by far. Okay, no other member state of the United Nations, I can tell you this, has total trade that is 3.5 times the size of its GNP. We are by far the most open, globalized economy. And for this open, globalized economy, the aviation sector is so critical, and certainly having your own airline is so critical. And if you wanted any proof of it, look at the Straits Times today. Who's delivering your COVID-19 vaccines? And you think that if in a crisis, and if you didn't have your own airline, you think any other country is going to tell its airline give priority to Singapore over our national needs? So there are some services that are absolutely critical for the economy. One of them is the aviation sector, and one of them is Singapore Airlines. And I can take a bet with anybody in this room that once COVID-19 is over, the aviation sector is going to bounce back dramatically. There are people like me who are dying to go around the world to complete their bucket list, to see what the hell, I didn't do these things. I thought I could do it anytime. Now now I'm not so sure. I'm going to rush and fly. There'll be billions of people flying, and so Singapore Airlines is going to bounce back. So it's a question of the government, therefore, taking the long view, which is a wise view, and I think DPM Heng Swee Keat made absolutely the right decision on Singapore Airlines.
Right. Yes, yeah.
It's really a question around what we term as strategic, right? Why do you need to be bailed out? And the challenge is, companies have tried to be leaner and leaner. So simple example, I'll give 2 or 3 that immediately come to mind. Texas was caught in if you read the papers, Texas had a freeze. Yeah. Why did it freeze? Texas froze because of a combination of reasons where the power plants were privatized. Yeah. The power plants were not connected to the rest of the grid because they didn't want to be subjected to federal laws. And this very thin operating margin, not winterized, not imposing standards, is great in times of high growth where you can then make a lot more profits. But when you go through a negative cycle, or you get this once in a long time sort of freak occurrence, then that is when you want insurance, right? And that is this fundamental tension of how much buffer do I have? How much do I want to retain strategic control? How much do I want to have my own assets? And any company will say, the difference between outsourcing versus focusing on my core, or I run a full stack. And the problem is that in a much increasingly volatile world, we're seeing whether you talk about supply chains, there is much more value to there's a lot more value to insurance. There's a lot more value to having your own assets. There's a lot more value to having buffer. And I think everyone is pricing in that if you are extremely asset light, then you lose a lot more levers of response.
Right.
Just a quick footnote to that. The Texas example is a perfect example of regulatory capture, because all these very innovative new arrangements said, okay, we don't want the government, we don't want regulation, we'll take care of everything. And of course, it works well in good times, but when you have a once-in-a-lifetime storm like this, everything falls apart.
But maybe 2 things more to say to that, though.
Yeah.
If the storm comes once every 20 years, I think the last time was like 30 or 40 years ago, is this a price that you're willing to pay? That a company, a state is willing to pay? If it's one every 50 years, 60 years, I mean, all life is precious, but if you take disruption once every 50 years, that's where all the actual statistics comes in. If it's going to be climate change every year, every third year, okay, we'll do it. If it's every 10, 20 years, that's a question mark. So that's maybe point one. Second point is that we impose standards. The problem is that standards don't change or take a long time to change, and it's very easy to over-prescribe standards. So, classic example, people joke about military spec, right? Where your screw is the same screw, but suddenly you now sell it for $9,000 per screw as opposed to 90 cents per screw because it's now mil spec. This is some apocryphal US story. But the point is, it's very easy to over-spec if you then apply standards to everything. So it can be too costly. So that's the flip side.
Can I just come back to this whole debate and discussion around what's strategic, what's of national interest, because it's a slippery slope that one can go down. Yeah. So I think usually when you go around like what's military defense, infrastructure for utilities and so on, there's usually very little debate about what's truly strategic and of national interest. It's when you then go on to who should provide those services that you then get into a lot of problems with state-owned enterprises that are inefficient, bloated, and just waste of resources.
You gave quite a few examples of that.
Yeah, and because of that, privatization becomes the solution.
Yeah.
So countries tend to go into a cycle. So they go into privatization, but with the P&L being the only focus, obviously they will tread very close to the line. They will not plant new capacity and so on. And then you get the classic Texas problem. So we will, I think, continue to go around such circulars of experiences over and over again. I don't think every economy would have learned from it. They will continue to go through it. And then, we've gone through our own public transportation services argument, right? Should it be government run? Should it be privately,
should it even be listed?
And so on. But we have seen how in some countries, the bus services are like the worst, the most inefficient. And then they have then gone on to a private sector solution provider. So unfortunately, I'm not optimistic that we will ever get around such a sort of circular experiences.
It requires a certain discipline, right? At the end of the day, it does. And your case study, Bailout of Last Resort, in that chapter, your case study of Qantas, for example, that's very instructive because it's not just about intervening, the government intervening, but how you intervene. It's not always going in to bail them out with cash, but sometimes, as in this case, in Qantas, right? The government, Tony Abbott's government, actually pushed Qantas against the wall and forced them to actually look at themselves and be a lot more disciplined. And they ended up actually turning around and delivering a whopping profit of 1.1 billion, from a complete loss situation. Now, would you want to share a little bit very quickly about that particular case?
Well, I don't understate the amount of political pressure they must have faced.
Yeah.
Because when it comes to rescuing your national pride, your national airline, there's just no limit, to what you must do. And I think for Qantas, well, actually the same thing is with South African Airways and many other airlines. This is not the first. And a government that's responsible and who thinks ahead, if this is going to be the last, then this will be the last bit of rescue effort that I'll put in. But if it's going to encourage the wrong discipline, commercial discipline, then I should do it now. But I will give them credit for, taking it, and sort of facing the issue on its head and sort of living with the political cost of it as well. Yeah.
So quickly, if I could go to the point about SOEs, state-owned enterprises. There's a general lament that state-owned enterprises around the world lack that kind of discipline that real private sector companies have, like some of the companies in the transport sector, ride-sharing companies like Gojek, Grab, Uber, they disrupted the entire industry. But there was a certain amount of commercial discipline that resulted in value for the customer, right? Now, is there this argument that we should really allow for a lot more true private sector enterprises and cut down on the number of SOEs, so to speak? That has been also talked about. Would you want to talk, since you're with Gojek?
Maybe I want to talk about the previous point first, and then I'll talk about that, right? Which is, should too big to fail, should they be bailed out? And the first point is not so much whether it is a good or bad performing company. It is that, is this sector important? If you look sectorally, I think I've read once that the airline industry has lost more money than it's made historically. So as a sector, it is just one where it is loss-making. But if you believe that the airline industry is important, and you're not a capital markets equity person, then you have to believe that then we should try to bail out this sector and keep it alive because it has importance beyond the financial value that it generates. And then of course, then there's the second order question, which leads to the point of what models then make for good innovation. And I think Singapore went through that in the early 2000s, where you can, in a quite small market like Singapore, you can either have a lot of competition, when we try to privatize our telecommunications, our healthcare, even our media groups, right? We have, but it is, I won't call it artificial competition, but it's competition that's quite subscale. Or you can have a single operator and have a regulator that then imposes standards on them. I think that there's the model is not what is going to win you, right? But I do believe if I had to pick between a strong regulator versus good competition, then I'd say probably competition is what will really be a better forcing mechanism in general. And if you look at the entry of Gojek into Singapore, I think there was an NUS study that was done that said that the entry of Gojek into Singapore basically meant better earnings for drivers and also slightly lower costs for riders. What that meant is that the platforms took a slightly smaller share of the profits that they were making. And that is the fundamental point of competition, that you need, in an open and contested marketplace, every company, if they aren't able to deliver, the customer will walk.
Yeah. When I remember in the 1980s, some of you may remember Zoo Batam, the radio station came out. I was in broadcasting then. And I tell you, I can admit to you that the quality of Singapore broadcasting radio was really bad at the time, so boring. And all of a sudden, it came alive. Just that introduction of Zoo, remember? Zoo Batam.
Zoo 101.6. And then we had 98.7 quickly after, and then Power 98.
So you see, the power of competition, but it has to be real competition, and that's something that you discuss in your book. If I could just move on to the whole issue of disruption, right? This point about go ahead.
Can I just go back to the issue around state-owned enterprises?
Yes.
Because you were saying, what do we do about them? So I think in economies where they are really a big part of it, it becomes a political issue because they also tend to employ a lot of people. So whatever structural changes or efficiency transformations you're thinking of would ultimately lead to a lot of job employment effects. And I think most governments just feel like it's just a little too difficult, to have to handle. But I would quote the case of China, which obviously has a lot of SOEs, and I mean the scale is way and well beyond what we can conceive here, and it would take them years, but it's the consistency and the pressing on towards that goal that I think will ultimately help them to make, even if it's marginal changes along the way, but improvements along the way.
Right. And those improvements, what I'm suggesting is that those improvements require government as well as the private sector to embrace disruption.
Yes.
And that comes through in your book as well. Like if you don't self-destruct, you will face self-destruction. And Ravi Menon, MD of Monetary Authority of Singapore, said, if we do not disrupt ourselves in a manner we choose, somebody else will in a manner we will not like. And there's a lot of truth in that. Any comment on that? The importance, for example, in fintech, they've come up with very well modeled regulatory sandboxes. It's a way to evaluate it.
I must say that's one of the most interesting parts of the book.
Yeah.
If you read what Hwee Hua says about how Singapore regulators try to keep up, right? I mean, we had all this Nets card and EasyLink card you discuss in your book, and how those legacies actually prevented us from going ahead, like in mobile payments. And to me, the shocking thing when I was living in Shanghai for 2 months researching my book, they're so far ahead of mobile payments. And the shocking thing is how seamlessly everything works. Okay, and I remember for me the shocking part is when I was buying my research assistant a farewell lunch in a restaurant, and I said to him, "What do we do?" He says, "Well, there's a QR code. You scan, press the menu, and we pick 2 Mongolian hot pot dishes. Very complicated. We press the button." And I said, let me see how long it takes to get 2 Mongolian hot pot dishes after I pressed the button.
Yeah.
And they came in 2 minutes. And I was stunned. We didn't talk to anybody. We didn't see anything.
Maybe they recognized
Press the button. No. They didn't know. In China? Nobody. So anyway, that was shocking. And then I said, my God, they're so far ahead of us technologically.
Absolutely.
And so I agree with Ravi Menon that we got to do some self-disruption. And I think that's why Singapore is actually very brave in allowing Gojek and Grab in. I think that was a good decision. It's a very good decision, because the only time I remember before they came along, when there was a thunderstorm, forget getting a taxi. No way.
No, but you see, there must be that courage, the willingness to really embrace that disruption and really deal with the naysayers, because the fear is natural. Fear of losing jobs and so on is natural, but I think the political will to be able to step into the arena. But I think the key here is also that, for example, this whole thing about regulatory sandboxes, it is a way to mitigate the risk by doing it in small scale, in a sandbox, literally, to evaluate the outcomes.
But that's in an ideal stage, an ideal situation. Often you don't really have. So in, say, the payment space that Kishore was talking about, it's actually sometimes the conundrum or the challenge is quite well illustrated there. You have the legacy system. What do? Do you junk it after you've paid so much for it and so on? And there are a lot of other stakeholders and so on. So this is something where then the government ultimately has to make the call. And I just want to hark back to the days when they opened up the telecommunication space. And what did they do? They actually compensated Singtel by taking away that privilege and so on. And I think if you have a government that's prepared to do that, because there's the larger good that is available, I would say that should be the way to go. But it's sometimes very hard to arrive at that decision. So Singtel, this was like back in, I think, late 90s and early 2000s. I remember because I quizzed the government on why it paid $388 million to Singtel, the compensation. But it's something that I will salute them for, because it's in exchange for a much wider development, within the sector.
You've been in Temasek. What's your very quick take on what's been your observation about the creation from the time Temasek was created in '74, and the whole issue of governance of the SOEs. There's a certain discipline. Very quick comment on how did we manage to keep that?
So I think for a long time, Temasek has actually sort of acted as a rather passive financial investor, even though it's the major, if not the whole wholly owned sort of shareholder of many companies. But it was in the early 2000s when we needed to grow our own enterprise, and the GLCs in those days, as they were called, were really the larger part or were a significant part of the economy, that we had to make sure that they were great engines of growth from Singapore. So the internationalization of the GLCs was important, but that requires a whole set of changes. And mind you, our GLCs at that time were already performing pretty well. So they were by no means bloated state enterprises that you see elsewhere. But it was just to take them to the next step. So you needed to make sure that boards were, directors were on board this whole mission. You have to make sure that the senior management, they had the right senior management in place to actually understand what was required.
Right.
And Temasek then began to flex its muscle according to its percentage, share in the respective country, and to influence it in a way that was helpful and constructive. So the early 2000s really saw that whole explosion of internationalization to a far greater extent of the TLCs or GLCs in those days. And I think they have not looked back, and they have gone on. I mean, sometimes it's challenging because you just have to shift or what they call pivot, into a different sector. So when oil and gas becomes challenging, then you just have to look at something else quite different. But that whole governance thing has been intact as far as I can see.
Right.
And I believe that that's really probably as good as it gets.
Sorry, Glenn, you were going to say something.
Trying to recall. There's so much to unpack there.
Maybe it'll come back. It could be a senior moment, for you as well.
He's the youngest man on this panel.
Yeah. Senior moment can happen to anyone who is not that senior as well.
No, he's always been precocious.
Okay, so
But anyway, so now actually,
Okay, yes.
now actually to recall, right? Which is, if you think of the question on the trade-off between regulation versus regulatory innovation versus sort of maintaining the status quo and the pain there. I think the example of Singtel was actually a really good one.
Yeah.
That will be the defining characteristic of successful innovation. Indonesia in 1997, when oil prices, and I mean we just had our own fuel hike a few days ago, which is something that I'm obviously observing with great interest professionally. And but look at how Singapore does it, right? Similarly, they said we are, we'll previously mitigate with road tax rebates. So the governments are bound to service everybody. Governments cannot choose who their customers are. Companies do. So if you still have people that need the traditional wet ink on paper infrastructure called checks, I mean that's completely antithetical to moving forward. But that is still a segment that needs to be serviced. If you can actually do something really good for them, whatever it might be, then that's the only way that you can move forward on innovation without being stuck in the incumbency.
I've been told that we have just over 10 minutes left, maybe 15. So I just want to move on to a couple of questions. One question is actually from one of the registered participants. The question is from Kamzo Noripa from Malaysia. I'll put two questions together because they're kind of related. The question is, public and private sector play has evaporated in my country, Malaysia. How do you suggest the private sector can progress? The other question is from Mohammed Abdul Ghazim from Oman. And the question is this: there's a perceived delay between the creation and execution of policy that is optimal for the requirements of the private sector. The communication of an issue by the private sector to the public sector and the time frame between the receipt and the communication and meaningful action are important. So it's quite a complex question, but really it's about the what happens between communicating intent and actually executing it.
So maybe
Yeah, if you could.
take that. I think public-private collaboration, nobody will dispute that. That's essential. But to get it right, there are probably two sort of buckets of challenges that I would like to just briefly talk about. The first is in the area of public policy formulation. The second is in the execution of whatever you formulated. And a lot of the challenges are actually in the conceptualization of the public policy or the changes thereof. And this is where the private sector, I think, frequently would love to be able to give more inputs into what will be helpful, what sort of incentives, what sort of grants, what sort of competition framework and all that will be useful. But that's not generally done or not done to an extent that will be helpful. So you always have very well laid plans that are
Not generally
great.
done where? Across the world? Or?
I would say it's common across many countries, and this will look really good on paper, but then one questions whether they will be effective. So the need there, I think, is really to involve the private sector as much as possible. That's not to say that you become you get taken hostage by the ideas and so on, but you just really need to get the inputs. And then when it comes to execution, so if you have done that, then hopefully your execution will be a lot easier, but it will not still be sheltered away, or rather, the most common complaint that one hears about government agencies around the world will be bureaucracy and red tape. And it could be as simple as you have conceived a very good plan to promote, say, SMEs, But then when it comes to actual implementation, it's like almost impossible to apply for the grant or to apply for help and so on, because civil servants just can't get around the public sort of bureaucracy and red tape and so on. So there should be a very conscious effort by governments to actually address that as well.
Right.
What are some of the hindrances, the barriers to actually executing plans? Yeah.
And that they should pick it up through deep conversations early enough with
That's
the
right.
private sector, with the
Yes,
players themselves.
yes, that's right.
Okay, very quickly, another question.
Sorry, can I
Yes.
just add on?
Yeah.
The governments that are successful at doing this are really the ones who are truly pro-business. So in other words, you go in with the approach that you really want to be as helpful as possible. That's not to say that you change your rules all the time,
Sure.
but you just want to be as helpful as possible. And that would be something I would encourage the respective governments to maybe, think about.
Yeah.
Maybe just to add in on that point, right? I think the second part of the question from the person from Oman was really around the speed and connecting that speed. And speed is of essence when the consequences and stakes are high.
Yeah.
But very often in many of these situations, when we're talking about innovation, what generally happens is that there's a small group of people that are affected negatively, and there's usually a large group of people that are positively affected to a smaller to a greater extent. For example, people that want to use cash, but now you're forced to use digital payments. Small group affected, very unhappy, very loud and very vocal, and everyone else who's benefiting may not be. It's a silent, sort of silent majority. So if it is absolutely critical, if it's life and death, I think, accident rates on PMDs, I think that was one of the main drivers of that. Then you move quickly. For the rest of it, it is fine to actually take a look at and let other people also be, other cities, other regimes, experiment and see how that plays out.
Yeah. Yes, Kishore.
I was going to say that this is an obvious point, but I think it has to be made, is that when you try to find the balance within the public and private sector, there's one important thing to watch out for, is corruption. And you've got to ensure that it's a very obvious, but unfortunately not emphasized enough. I mean, if you look, for example, at 1MDB, SOE.
Yeah.
And what happened? What went wrong? So clearly, you need to set very clear boundary markers and not just set the markers, but implement them very hard. Because if you don't, then you have the problems like what you have in
And especially when the
DB.
intersections become larger.
And that is fortunately for Singapore, and I think Hwee Hua's book brings it out. So that's one of our big strengths. That the fact that we have almost zero corruption in Singapore, and therefore you can have a healthy relationship within the public sector and the private sector, where you can debate the merits of the policy without having to worry whether or not that policy has been affected by some money going under the table. So that's why it's important to table it and say, if you want to have a healthy relationship within the public sector and private sector, first kill corruption.
Absolutely. And that also builds public trust.
I need to jump in on this point, right? I think, Kishore, previously, before this conversation, we were talking about the opioid crisis in the US and how the Sackler family and, aided in part by the management consultants that they used. And so the governments will want to regulate, and you can do things that are legal. And I think the management consultancy settled with 49 states without admitting guilt. But they 600 million, I think, is not a small sum. But the point is that private companies also need to regulate themselves well. We're lucky in Singapore. Take ride-hailing again. Operators are regulated. Cars are inspected every year, and drivers have licenses. In other regimes, other countries where you don't have these three levels, the companies themselves actually need to provide some version of this, some version of insurance. So all the things that are underwritten due to the hard work, of the regulators, will need to be replicated by companies if they are a large player.
Right.
So hard work must be done somewhere, whether the private sector or the public sector.
Agreed.
In our case, the public sector does a lot of it.
Right. Now, I've been told that there's only 5 minutes left. I'm going to ask for another 5 minutes, right? Now, there's this question from Dr. Fong Cheng Hong from Singapore. Why can't the government focus on inequality and wealth distribution and happiness of its people and let the private sector do the business? I mean, it's a very obvious question, but I think the answer can be a lot deeper. Right?
I'll give one quick point, which relates to what I was saying earlier, that the government needs to take care of every citizen. The government doesn't get to choose who its customers are. Companies do. So if the government was purely around redistribution of wealth, companies will still pick and choose who they service. And that's why there's a minimum baseline and a very high baseline that we have here of provision of public services.
Right. Yeah.
And you wouldn't have the private sector if you didn't have a government. Because if you want a good example of a country where you have complete freedom in the private sector and no government, I invite you to go to Somalia. Try to do business in Somalia, and you realize maybe you need government.
Yeah.
So maybe just a final point that really there's this real thing called market failure.
Yes.
Who is going to build the roads, the highways, the airport, the seaport, the schools, the hospitals?
The safety.
If the government doesn't do it.
Yeah. And I think a case in point is Ministry of Education deciding in 2012 to go into preschool education, right? And I think the Singapore government, the Ministry of Education, resisted that for a long time, and I think for too long, but they went in, and initially there was lukewarm response, and today, in 2019, I think 4,000 kids registered, and now they're going to increase the number, right? They're going to increase the number of schools provided directly by Ministry of Education. This is where government has actually made the decision going into business, into the private sector for the right reasons, right? And you're going to double the number of schools by Ministry of Education to, in fact, triple to 60 schools, I think, in 2025. And the budget has been increased from 1 billion to 2 billion just for this sector alone. Now, would you say that this is the right thing to do? Or the other way the government could have done is franchise it, give it to selected private sector players. But here, the government chose to go in directly and operate the schools.
So I would just say that, what Minister Chan has said just now, which is that the government is never wedded to its plans. If the reality has changed in terms of public expectations, and public expectations are around the idea that preschool is now part of formal school.
Yeah.
So where in the past it starts at primary 1, now it starts earlier.
Yeah.
And therefore the government is obliged to provide.
But why couldn't they have
and
engaged
to-
a private sector player to do
and
it?
to ensure a certain delivery of quality at an affordable cost. So it's all that which I think led to the fact that they probably are most confident of doing it only when they do it themselves. Yeah.
I mean,
Right.
a quick answer to that would be early education is a public good or even a merit good, as the economists call it. I think everyone knows friends who have children in international schools. International school 1 year costs more than going to university.
Yeah.
Right? And so that clearly prices it out of the range of, 90% and 95% of the people out there. But is it a good education? Sure. But is it fully accessible education? It
Absolutely.
is not.
So it's public good. So I'd like each one of you, to run out of time. There are many other questions we can ask, but I think this is all the time we have. So quick comments from each one of you, starting with you, Lian.
Let Kishore go first.
Okay.
Well, I would say that honestly, and I mean this quite sincerely, that we in Singapore are very blessed. We have a very unusual situation in Singapore where there's a very healthy balance within the public sector and the private sector, where the private sector doesn't try to control or influence the government. And the government also tries very hard not to rule it with a heavy hand.
Yeah.
And of course, our government makes mistakes. Every government makes mistakes. But by and large, when other countries look around the world and look for a kind of the best working model of public-private sector partnership, I think they will come to Singapore. And that's why I think, Hwee Hua, your book is so important, because you sort of describe what Singapore does through various stories. And I think that this is something that is of great interest to the rest of the world.
Yeah.
I like one of the opening lines or subheadings in the book was, I think, give them a break, or give the government a break. And I mean, it really echoes what Kishore is saying. By its nature, governments will be lagging in terms of regulation, right? It doesn't make sense to regulate something that isn't even in existence. Some things you can see coming. We know AI ethics, for example, is coming. What are the ways, shapes, and forms? You could have some sort of thoughts about it, but it's, I think, it's like worrying about the famous quote is like worrying about overpopulation on Mars, right? We're not even there yet. So by its nature, governments will be lagging, and getting that balance and attention right. Do you want to overwinterize your Texas plants? That is the fine balance, which will be really difficult to get right. On balance, I think the amount of support regulation standards that we afford and we enjoy as a common platform to allow companies then to operate. So I mean, I know that we don't really have to worry so much about driving tests, driving proficiency. I mean, it's all well done, right? That then is a common base for which companies can then innovate. That's net a good way forward for us.
Great.
I think we're very much a product of what we do not have. In other words, no natural resources and so on. So we wind up being a nation that is completely paranoid, that's completely sensitive to what would affect our survival. And that's why you have this nice collaboration. I mean, it's almost like unspoken trust across government. It's need to be dynamic, to be ready, to be fast moving, and you have and to be pro business as well. And then you have the business sector that knows that it has to be nimble-footed, it has to operate without waiting for any handouts or anything. And the people generally also to be able to support, whether as people in terms of the public as expectations of public services, or as employees of the companies that build up Singapore economy. So I think in a way we have been at this for a long time. I think we're a slightly better placed to react. It's not that the challenges are a lot easier, but I think we're slightly better placed. But that trust has to be continued built
Absolutely.
upon.
Yeah.
And if I may just sum up, my own take, having read your book and I enjoyed it very much, is that you're not prescribing. You know, the tone is not prescriptive. You are sharing from real life examples and case studies, which is very credible. Minister Chan Chun Sing mentioned earlier, you know, about making it a lot more porous, you know, having talent cross from private sector to the public sector. I think that therein may lie the solution to a lot of these things, because it's not about government lagging. It's about government being involved without being obtrusive. Being involved. And one good way of being involved is having a revolving door between government and private sector. Why not? We've done it before in other areas. But I think having a revolving door not only increases the transfer of knowledge and experience in a real-time basis. Number two, it also builds trust in the process. And I think that's the kind of direction we should take. And the minister talks about regulatory flexibility. And I think the real strength that Singapore government has is captured in the three words the minister mentioned, which is about transparency, consistency, and accountability. On that note, I'd like you to join me in thanking the panel.
Thank you, Mr.
And a big congratulations to the author of a terrific book.
Thank the participants for the webinar as well.
And everyone who's dialed in on Zoom.
Yeah.
And everyone on Zoom, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mrs. Lin, Professor Kisham Amrani, Mr. Lian Shongyuan, and Mr. Vizwa Sudasivan for the insightful discussion. Ladies and gentlemen, this brings us to the end of our program. On behalf of the organizers, I'd like to thank once again Minister Chan, who has taken his leave earlier. And I'd like to thank all our guests here and virtually for joining us on this special occasion. The book is on sale at the foyer. If you prefer to purchase them online, it is also available at this website at bit.ly/gov&biz, and enjoy a 20% discount with the code WSGB20 until the end of March. With that, we wish you a very good evening and good afternoon where you are. Thank you. Thank you all.